Christ, master builder, I laid the foundation.
Hey, shalom, guys. Welcome to another interview special. I'm so excited for this. Dr. Douglas Hamp with me today. Brother Shalom, how you doing?
Hey, Shalom. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me, Will.
No, I was super excited. I've seen some of your stuff on mostly on TikTok, and then I had to go look you up because a lot of the things that you were saying was just fantastic. Now, one of the big things about my channel is, as you can see from the opening, 1 Corinthians 3:10, like a wise master builder, right? Wise master builder, you laid the foundation. I am a very big person on pronomianism and the Torah, guys. Anyone who is a Christian, anyone who's a follower of the Bible, especially Yeshua, Jesus Christ, you got to have that Torah as your foundation, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. And you, Dr. Douglas Hamp, are definitely one of those leaders, those shepherds, leading people to Yeshua, leading a pronomian Torah-based congregation. So I don't know if my audience knows you very well. So go ahead, take this, introduce who you are, what you do. You have a doctor next to your name, right? So go ahead, go introduce yourself.
All right. Well, so I lead a congregation here in the Denver area. So if you guys are ever here on Shabbat, Saturday, please come and join us. We're technically in Lakewood. I'd love to meet you in person. That'd be fantastic. I spent 3 years studying in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where I studied all kinds of ancient languages, including Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, and others. And I started to discover this other side of my faith. It took me a long time to really get on board with it because I went there sort of as an outsider looking in, and I'm like, oh, this is what the Jews do. It's interesting. And, I finally I kept crossing these milestones of where I was like, wait a second. In fact, it's funny because I used to work for Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. So if people know Pastor Chuck Smith, Greg Laurie, all of that, that kind of that church basically in California, I was part of that. And there was this Jewish woman, this anti-missionary Jewish woman that would call in and she would confound the pastors because she would ask them hard questions about the Old Testament, New Testament, and they didn't know the answers. So they're like, Doug, can you talk to this woman? We don't have to say to her, right? So we would talk for, she would call and we would talk for a long time. And she did this for years. And, by the end, I got her to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. I was like, yes. But she also, she talked to me, right? And she got me to question why I wasn't keeping the Torah. And she wasn't trying to convert me to Torah so much as I kept saying, well, you Jews are just, keeping the law to try to earn God's favor. And she's like, no, we're not. I said, yes, you are. You don't know your own theology. She said, no, we do it because God said to. And I was like, wait, that kind of makes sense. Like, and I was like, who am I to tell them not to keep Sabbath and to not eat clean? It took me a while to have this paradigm shift. But man, I'll tell you, once you have a paradigm shift, you can't go back, right? That's the trouble with paradigm shifts, right? And I was like, holy cow, what am I doing telling her to not do what God said to do? And I thought, if it was so good back then, if God had given those things to them, why would he suddenly take them away? And then my theology just started to fall apart because I was obviously a dispensationalist, and for dispensationalism to work and the pre-trib rapture to work, you have to have the dispensational element of it. And the dispensational element, as the name implies, you have to have dispensations. You have to have these epochs of time where God did one thing in one way for one group of people at one time, and now he's doing it quite differently. And that's the basic idea. So there's 7 dispensations. I won't go into all of them, but the 2 most important are the age of law and then the age of grace. Of course, we're in the age of grace. Isn't that wonderful? And God got rid of the age of law. Jesus nailed it to the cross, and we don't have to do that anymore. We don't have to keep the law to be saved. I mean, I heard that a million times growing up and all these sermons. We don't have to keep the law to be saved. Christ fulfilled it. He did all this stuff for us, and yay. And you're like, oh man, thank God I don't have to try to work my way into heaven like those poor Jews did back then. And that was my basic framework. Growing up, I didn't question it. I thought it was absolute gospel truth. And yes, I studied the Bible, I learned it, and I took all those verses and that great stuff that I was learning, and I put it into that framework, right? And so then my paradigm simply got stronger because I was learning it with those particular glasses on. But once my glasses cracked, thanks to that anti-missionary woman, I was like, oh my goodness, and I started taking them off, and I'm like, oh wow, look at that, I'm starting to see stuff in color instead of black and white, and well, it kind of ruined me, right? And I was a lot more popular back then. I was speaking at end times prophecy conferences, and it was great. I mean, the money was good, everything was good. And then I started questioning the paradigm, and I started looking for verses about the pre-trib rapture. I'm like, where is this verse or verses that we use to talk about our faith and this major doctrine that we believe? Where is it? And nobody could tell me. I was one of the experts speaking with experts at these conferences about the pre-trib rapture, and none of us knew. I'm like, well, this isn't a good sign. This is bad, right? If none of us knows where the verse is, and you're just getting sideways glances, then I knew I was in trouble. And yeah, I was definitely booted from the club shortly thereafter. And I've been told that I am putting people back under the law. I'm going to hell because I'm encouraging people to keep the Sabbath. I'm encouraging people to eat clean. And, I mean, this one pastor, he and I talked for about an hour one day, and then he hung up kind of in a gruff, and then he called me back 6 hours later, and it was like this drive-by shooting. That's how it felt. I pick up the phone. He's like, Doug, I just spoke with your former boss, and you've fallen into the Galatians heresy. And if you don't repent, you're going to go to hell. Click, right? I'm like, oh my gosh, right? Wow, what just happened? But he was really frustrated because everything that he kept saying, I had a counter argument to it. And not that I was trying to win the argument, but I was trying in my best way. I was trying to lovingly show him that we dispensationalists, which I had, I didn't claim that anymore, but I had, once I was there, we were dividing, we were rightly dividing the word of truth. That's one of the favorite passages. And what they do is they really divide it away. In fact, I just made a video. I'm going to put it up on TikTok really soon. The man who divided the Bible, who took a knife to the Bible. This would be none other than Marcion. Marcion literally took a knife to the Gospels to cut out the parts that were too Jewish. All right. This is a name that most people have never heard of. Marcion, who is Marcion? He's a 2nd century heretic that the early church was trying to stamp out because they realized how dangerous his doctrines were. But here's the scary part. They didn't really succeed. Marcionism lived on. Marcionism won. And Marcionism, to a larger extent, has become what we would call Christianity. In fact, there was an exchange between a Marcionite and a true Bible believer around the 6th century. And one of them was crossing the Tigris River. And the non-Marcionite, he said, are you a Christian or a Jew? And he said, both. Right? Or the Marcionite asked this, they asked each other anyway. And he's like, what do you mean you can't be both? And he's like, no. Where I'm from, to be a Christian is to be a true follower of Christ. And I'm Jewish, and the other guy's like, wait, this is crazy. Because where I come from, when you say Christian, you really mean Marcionite. Imagine if it's kind of like if you go to Utah and you ask somebody there, are you a Christian? There's like, yeah, of course I am. But what they really mean is that they're a Mormon, right? And that's essentially what has happened. I call it the ghost of Marcion. This ghost, it's the ghost of our theology. It's our haunted theology. And I've got a video on that if people want to check it out on YouTube, Haunted Theology and the Ghost of Marcion. This has infiltrated and taken over and disguised itself as true Christianity. Now, let me be very careful. I'm not one of those people that says, well, if you eat pork and you're a Christian, you're more like a pagan. I don't think that. I used to love Jesus and I eat pork. Was I a pagan? I don't think so. I mean, I was really zealous for the Lord. I read the Bible, I studied it, I memorized it, and I was eating pork. Why? Because that's what I had been taught. I had been taught that that was okay. And so I'm not one of those that's going to throw stones at people and say, "Oh, you're just going straight to hell." I don't think that, but I do think that all of us have areas of our theology where we can definitely improve. And that was one of the areas where I've improved. But now I want to learn to love people better, right? I want to keep doing those things, the weightier matters of the law. And anytime we get into this conversation about the law or not law, or people that are keeping it or not keeping it, I think we've got to be very careful, because when you start saying we're pronomian, we're for the law, and someone says, well, I'm not. Hey, look, most Christians that we know, let's talk about the zealous Christians, not the weak ones, okay? But the ones that are truly zealous for Jesus, and yet they go to church on Sunday, they eat pork, etc. They're keeping the law for the most part, right? Because they're loving God, they're loving their neighbor. They're not murdering people, generally speaking. Okay. They're doing the things that God said to do. There's 3 areas, really. It's only 3 areas that we pretty much would disagree. And that is keeping the 7th day Sabbath, eating clean. So not eating animals God said are not food, such as pork and shrimp and crab and all that, and keeping the feasts. Those are basically the 3 things that we would say, hey, those are still for today. But your average Christian that isn't doing those things, they still love their neighbor. They don't murder them. They're trying to be kind to people and loving toward people. So I think we just have to be very careful. And I would love to see the pronomian community kind of get more on board with these things, so that we're not throwing everybody under the bus, because it's just not fair. It's just not fair. And it puts up a major wall. Like, if our goal is to help our Sunday pork eating brothers to start worshiping on Saturday and to stop eating pork, if that's truly our goal and love is our motive, then we have to do it in such a way that they're going to be able to hear us. Because if we start coming and we start throwing stones, well, of course their shields go up. Of course they're going to become defensive and they're not going to listen. So we've got to find a different way to get this message out there for people.
Yeah, one of the pork things, and that's what a lot of people will tell me is, I will say, look, you do whatever you want, but God tells us that this is not food. And if you're still going to eat it, don't get mad at God if you get unhealthy or if you get a disease or anything like that. Now, a good example I like to try to bring up is, obviously, and Dr. Hamp here, please correct me if I'm wrong, but you and I would both say that murdering someone is a lot worse than eating pork. I think you would even agree with that with me.
Wholeheartedly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely. It's worse to murder somebody than to eat pork, for sure.
Absolutely. But still, eating pork is breaking the law. And I look at it like this. So my son, he had he's going into kindergarten, so he's still in pre-K, but he had a piece of paper that had math problems on it. So it was a whole bunch of designs. It was 2 + 3, and then obviously on the top of the paper it had 5, and then you would color that little point there a color. So when he follows everything, it actually came out to be a lion. So it had the yellow lion, orange mane, blue background, some trees and stuff like that. But then also what he did was, when he came home, he really wanted to color this. It was painting. He was painting this little fence with an orange, with a pumpkin and stuff like that. And what he did was he mixed all the colors together and he just painted all one color. And I'm like, my son's name is Elijah. And I asked him, I'm like, but see what here, you did this properly, right? You did the instructions properly, and look how beautiful it came out. Where we have this picture here that you did not use it properly. And look, it's just a mess. The painting is over the black lines. You didn't stay inside the lines. You didn't use the proper colors, where it's a mess. And I feel like that's the same thing with us. As a father, I felt disappointed in my son because he's very good. He makes the most wonderful drawings. So for him to make a sloppy drawing, I told him, I'm disappointed. I'm sad by this. And it's like, how much more when God designed our bodies, how amazing our bodies are, our metabolism, what we digest, how we breathe, the flapper like in our throat to go from the oxygen to eating. Our bodies are an amazing piece of art. And how sad is our Father when we are putting things in our body that don't belong there?
Exactly. Yeah, it's putting the wrong gasoline in your car, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is the thing, again, as a father, I taught my kids when they were really little, 3, 4, 5, like, make sure to look both ways when you cross the street. And of course, back then I was holding their hand and I was helping them. And, this is a very important lesson that they have to learn. And, I was proud of them when they learned to do it themselves, and they probably felt some pride. I mean, I remember what I did when I was a little kid. I'm doing this for mommy, I'm doing this for daddy. I'm looking both ways. My parents are going to be so proud of me. That was great when I was 4. But when I was 24, I wasn't thinking I'm going to look both ways for my parents' sake, because that was never the point. It was never for my parents, right? And I'm not eating clean for God. I'm eating clean for me. And it changes the entire dynamic. It changes why I'm doing this. It's still, healthy or not, but the motivation is completely different now. And I'm not trying to just please God by eating clean. God's like, hey, I'll be okay if you don't eat properly. And what I told my kids, if they don't look both ways, I'm like, look, if you don't look both ways, you'll be dead. All right. And I'll be really sad because you'll be gone, but you'll be dead. And it seems like that message stuck, okay, that they would be dead if they didn't look both ways. And so, yes, I do think God is sad when we ingest things that are on his list of this is not food, because he knows that it's unhealthy for us. But he's not sad in the sense that, well, you really blew it, son. I think he's more sad as like, gosh, son, you're ingesting things that are poisonous. And that doesn't make me happy because I want you to be healthy. I want you to have a good quality of life. I want you to have life at full capacity instead of what you're doing, and it just changes the whole dynamic of why we're doing this. You mentioned your son painting within the lines, and that's wonderful when you're 5 or whatever, or 6, to do that kind of stuff. And, it's not just that God wants us to paint inside the lines, though. He wants us to create beautiful art, and
Right.
and when you're 5, there are lines there to help you and to kind of figure this out. And that's what the law is about. It's there to help us discover these instructions of how to do it. It's the user's manual. I think of it like driving a car. I've been driving for many years. I'm sure you've been driving for a lot of years too. How often do you get your driver's manual out when you are driving your car? You ever done that? I mean, no, why not? I mean, why don't you get your driver's manual out? You probably should, just to make sure you're doing it exactly right. No, I mean, well, obviously you don't have to, because where is the instruction manual? It's right here, right? Or right here, wherever we put that thing, right? It's ingrained in us so much that after driving for, 2, 3 decades, you can do it on autopilot because it's now part of your DNA. It's part of your operating system. You're not having to think about it consciously. It just happens, And I mean, I've had those times where I'm driving and then I find myself at my destination. I'm like, holy cow, I totally spaced out while I was driving. I wasn't even thinking about the stop signs. And I mean, I did all the stuff, right? I did it, but I wasn't really conscious of it. And that is where God wants the law to be part of us so much that we're not consciously thinking about it, but it's just part of the operating system, right? That's where he says in Jeremiah that he's going to write it in our hearts and in our minds so that it's now in us. It's in us, and we're not having to think about it. Ever since I stopped eating pork years ago, I have zero desire to go back to it. I think I would be absolutely sick. When I even smell it or I think about it, I start to feel sick to my stomach because it's something that is no longer part of my diet. It's not part of my routine and my lifestyle, and my body, I think, would reject it because it's poisonous. It's something that is unhealthy. When I was in Israel in 2018, I was leading a group, and I had not had Coca-Cola in probably a decade. I thought maybe I'll just have a Coke. It's been so long, and in Israel they use real sugar instead of high fructose corn syrup. Maybe I'll just do it. And I had this Coca-Cola, and boy, did I regret it, because I had the worst heartburn that a man can ever have. I thought I was going to die. I'm
Oh
like,
no.
this can't just be heartburn, but it's heartburn. And it was torment. I was like, okay, I'm never going to do that again. I never, ever, ever want to drink Coca-Cola again, and, but of course it wasn't a sin to drink a Coke, but it kind of was. It was definitely a sin for me, because it was something that led to pain. It led to discomfort. It led to a type of sickness that I was having for a day and a half. It was definitely a sin. It wasn't a moral sin, but it was something that, well, it didn't sit well, and that's ultimately what God's instructions are all about. And I really want us to reframe this, where I gotta do these things or God's gonna be mad at me. God's just like, hey Doug, how you feel? How's your heartburn? It sucks, Lord. Yeah, sorry about that, right? And that's kind of where we are when we do things. We have behaviors, or we ingest things, or we don't take a break. There's a story by Ariana Huffington. She started the Huffington Post, and she was working so hard to get her newspaper off the ground that she was just working herself to death, and one day she fainted at her desk out of pure exhaustion. And she woke up, she had a broken cheekbone, and she was in blood, because she was just working nonstop. And she had to stop and say, wait, is this what success looks like? Is it worth it to push this hard so that I literally faint at my desk out of exhaustion? Well, clearly that's not what God wants for us. And so God gave us, he built in a day off that we would take that day. And he said, this day I have blessed. I've blessed it. It's called the seventh day. It's the Sabbath day. Why Christians don't keep it? Well, I would point to Marcion, but it is weird, when you start talking about these things with our fellow Christians, they start getting they start getting this weird vibe about them. Like, well, I don't have to do that stuff. I'm like, well, yeah, you don't. Paul says, all things are possible, right? He doesn't say all things are lawful, but he says all things are doable. You can do anything. Just ask Adam and Eve. Can you eat of that fruit? Sure, you can. That's the whole point. You've got the freedom to eat of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, but I wouldn't recommend it, because it's not healthy for you. It could ruin your whole day. In fact, it could ruin thousands of years for all of your descendants, But are you free to do it? Yes, you are absolutely free to do it. Are people free to not keep the Sabbath? Of course. Of course. And I think that by not keeping the Sabbath, we as a general society, we have all kinds of health problems. We have societal problems. I think wars, you could probably, if we could really trace these back, it'd maybe be a difficult lesson to do. But I think, if we could point these back and say, what is the real underlying cause of some of our societal ills and our health problems and cancer and mental health issues? I think a lot of it could go right back to not keeping the Sabbath, probably eating foods that are not food. Okay. And not being on God's rhythm. I mean, it's just really that simple. But, again, to absolutely prove that is another question. But, God's commandments are for our good. They're not against us.
Now, going with that, God's laws being good and everything else, like we briefly talked about, eating the foods that eating the meats, excuse me, that God considers food for us. Obviously, you're going to be healthy. You gave the example with pork. You don't eat, you smell it, you just kind of gag. You had the Coke and everything like that. God's laws are literally that. Like even the not mixing the two types of fabrics. And it's interesting. I read a scientific article many years ago talking about if you actually mix those two fabrics, it actually lowers your immune system.
Yeah.
And how amazing is that? And you
Mhm.
brought up the Sabbath too. There's that phrase, "Oh, you're going to work yourself to death," right? Where people can overwork and you're over exhausting yourself.
Mhm.
So let me just ask you about you and your family. What benefits have there been of you guys observing a Sabbath, taking the day of rest, stop working, having that family time? How has that benefited you?
Well, taking the Sabbath it's been really good because it's a day when you can take a nap with zero guilt. You can, but we also, of course, we fellowship, and just being with other people who are also want to share that time with Christ, with God, talking about God, coming together as a community. It's very important. It's wonderful, and it's a reset. You always need a reset. The word recreation, it's literally recreation. Okay, so you're recreating creation, right? This is where we go back. We need to get a recharge, an infusion of energy. And the way you get it is by stopping. And it's not just this legalistic thing. Well, I better do this or God's going to strike me down. He's like, no, I don't need to strike you down. You'll strike yourself down, bro. When you don't do it, then you have this accumulation. But when you take that break, it's like, back in the 1990s, early 2000s, when you had the defrag thing on your computer, right? You'd have to defrag your computer every so often.
Mhm.
That's kind of what you're doing every week is you're doing a little defrag on your mind, on your soul. You're letting there just be time of quiet, giving space to reset. And if you don't have a reset, well, then guess what? You never reset. And so then you have an accumulation, right? You have more and more tension, more and more stuff that just keeps to build up. It's like that rubber band that you keep pulling and pulling and pulling until finally it either, it hits you and snaps you or it's going to break. And that is where we are. If you don't give it time to release the energy, release the tension, then it's going to keep building up and eventually something is going to snap. How could it snap? Well, it can lead to all kinds of bad stuff, so yeah, that, that's really important. And, of course, this is where a lot of Christians, they say, well, what about Paul? Paul says we don't have to do these things. Paul says it doesn't really matter. Well, that's not true at all. In the book of Acts, Paul was eager to get back to Jerusalem in time for celebrating Pentecost, right?
Mhm.
Acts 20. He wants to get back there so he can celebrate Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, right? So this is after the cross. This is after Jesus. We're well into the age of grace, as it were. And yet Paul says he wants to get back to Jerusalem to keep the feast. Well, there you go. When Eutychus, the young man, fell out the window, that was it was the first day of the week. Well, yeah, but let's unpack that for just a second. The first day of the week begins when? Does it begin Sunday morning or does it begin Saturday night, as we would call it? Well, it begins Saturday night. When I was in Israel, they had something called Motzei Shabbat. It's the coming out after the Sabbath. And basically, when the sun goes down, let's say it goes down at 7:30. So the sun goes down, and then at around 8 o'clock, people open up their shops again. So you can go out and get ice cream. You can go out and do some light shopping. You can go to, Ben Yehuda, Rehov Ben Yehuda, and you can just kind of walk around and do some window shopping or ice cream or coffee or whatever. And it was just this really nice time of the day because you didn't have to get really back to work so much. But you could still, but you were free to go and do whatever. And that time, this time called Motzei Shabbat, the time after the Sabbath, Saturday evening, not going into Sunday yet, but Saturday evening, that has been celebrated for at least 2,500 years, if not even more. So by the time of Paul, this kind of quiet time after the formal Sabbath has ended, Saturday evening, that is when he was preaching, right? So he probably started around 8 o'clock. He starts preaching, and he's going for a couple hours, and then Eutychus, he's just tired. It's 10, maybe 11, maybe 12, I don't know, in the evening, and this kid just falls asleep and falls out the window. But what happens in Christianity is they're like, well, see, Paul started preaching Sunday morning, and then he preached all through the day, and then this young man fell asleep Sunday night. No, that's completely wrong. It was Saturday evening, which was technically the first day of the week. Yes, technically the first day of the week. But it was the twilight period of the first day of the week, Saturday evening. And then the next day, after they had gone to bed, the sun had gone down, or the sun was down, and then it finally came back up. That is when they set out on the ship for the new place, right? So again, just by understanding these things in a different perspective, and what do we lose? Do we have to work 24/7? People that have to work all the time, aren't they called slaves?
Yeah.
Right? When you get to take time off, aren't we all dreaming of the weekend? We're dreaming of a day off. We're dreaming, I want to go on vacation. God's like, well, I built it into your calendar. Oh, well, you can't make me do that. You can't make me take a day off. Well, okay. But you're the one that loses out.
It is funny because, if you say, well, God said that we should take a day of rest. Oh, you're a legalist. Oh, well, my boss at work said I should take a rest. Oh, you're so lucky. Your boss is so great and wonderful. Right? It's so funny how polar opposite those ideas are. And the people who make these claims are Christians, are people who, yes, Jesus is the Messiah. I believe in the Bible. It is my scriptures. And so many of them, I tell them, like, guys, you're making atheist arguments. Like, I don't think I'll show you grace. I don't think you're doing it on purpose, but you are, you're putting yourself under slavery. God's laws, our father, he's not just a guy, he's a father. He's really, come on, like, please think about what you're saying before you say it.
I know. I know. I know. It's
interesting, really quick. Have you ever read this book? It's called Misreading Scriptures with Western Eyes. And this book really gets you to think differently, just because, as you said, when does this day start? Us with the Western mindset, oh, well, the day starts, at midnight. Midnight, that's when the Sunday is. But that's not how days work according to the Bible.
Right.
So it's a really fantastic book, actually. And real quick, I just want to make mention, just because my channel is very aware of Digital Pastor Jim. I know you have met him. He's a friend of yours, and you guys had the Passover together then, right?
We did. Yeah. Yeah. He came and he brought Max Bonilla from California. And Max is a really cool young man, and putting out some great content as well. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. And, Passover, that's another example of just a blessed time. Jesus was keeping the Passover. Why are we so against keeping Passover? I mean, it's like, our Lord and our Savior, our teacher, our Redeemer, he was the one who was doing these very things. Why would we not do them? Why would we not keep these things? Oh, well, Christ is the end of the law. Well, really? Do you think that's what Paul was really saying? The end of the law, the telos. The word telos can mean termination. It's possible. But it could also mean the point of, the goal of, right? So, when a person goes to school, let's say you're going to become a doctor, when you graduate, is that the end of your studies? Well, yeah. But it was also the point of your studies, right? I mean, you don't become a doctor and say, well, I don't need that stuff anymore. Like, no, that was the whole point. You studied so that you can take that into your medical practice and now use it, apply it, right? That was the whole point. So Jesus, as the so-called end of the law, he's the goal of the law. And this cuts both ways. I want to make that really clear. For the people that are against the law, it definitely cuts against them, because this whole false notion that, well, I don't have to do that stuff anymore. Like, well, no, you're wrong. I mean, the point of the law is Christ. Christ is the point, and it cuts the other way for people who are pronomian, because I've seen this as well. I've been a Messianic pastor, Hebrew roots, whatever, for about 10 years now, and I see the Torah terrorist side. You know, people start coming into it, they're brand new, and they're like, oh, we got to do all this stuff, and people who are not doing it right are completely wrong, and we can't hang out with them. And I've seen relationships broken, families broken. I've seen, you know, hard feelings that have come because people have come in with their theological gun and they start shooting and they start telling everybody they're all wrong. Christ is the goal of the law. So, in fact, I had coffee with a guy probably about 4 or 5 years ago, and he was telling me how he's trying to convert everybody to the law, to the Torah. And I'm like, wait, what do you mean convert people to the Torah? That's not our goal. My goal is not to convert people to Torah. My goal is to point people toward Yeshua. And if I can get that one thing right, if I can point people to Jesus, to Yeshua, who did keep the law, who lived it perfectly, but he did it with grace. He did it with love. He did it with compassion. That's what happens. So on the pro-Torah side, we sometimes forget about compassion. We forget about love. And now we're about the letter of the law. And I think this is where Paul, after much, you know, a lot of failings and a lot of question marks in his own mind, he finally came to this place. He's like, oh, I get it. You know, yeah, Christ is the end of the law. He's the goal of the law. It's not the law for law's sake. He spent most of his life doing that very zealously. And let's be clear. Again, this is for our antinomian friends. Paul wasn't, I mean, yeah, he had a lot of Pharisaic kind of things in there for sure. Okay. But he says, you know, that he was flawless in keeping the law. But what he thought was somehow gained that by doing these things that he would grow closer to Christ or closer to God, he discovered, oh, I've kind of, you know, I've missed the forest through the trees, as it were. And he realized that it wasn't about the letter of the law. It's the spirit of the law. And if I can get the spirit of the law correct, then I don't have to really worry about the letter of the law. And what happens when people come into Torah, they start learning about the letter of the law. And I'm not against the letter of the law, okay? Don't get me wrong. But the letter of the law in and of itself, it doesn't bring you joy and peace. It makes you now a Torah police, you know? Now you're the food police. You're the Sabbath police. You're out there checking everybody's papers. Are you doing it right? I've met those people. Sometimes they come to my church, you know, and I'm always having like, guys, we're about Jesus. We're not about converting people to Torah. We're about the King. We want to be about his business. We want to make disciples in his image. And did he keep Sabbath? Of course he did, you know. But you know what's so funny is the Sabbath, clean eating, the feast. These are not even like a 101 class for the disciples. All right. They'd been doing this stuff since they were kids. They're like, well, of course we keep the Sabbath. I mean, why would we not keep the Sabbath? Right. Well, of course we eat clean. Why would we not eat clean? Right. I mean, they were not even thinking these things. But for some of us who are now coming into this stuff is also brand new. And we're like, oh my goodness, we got to do all this stuff right. And so now we find ourselves in a very different era because we're trying to make sense of what God's word says in light of the last 2,000 years of Marcionism. And we're trying to unpack this stuff. We're trying to like, well, wait a second. You know, so let's take, you know, a classic example, Acts chapter 10. There Peter is up on top of Cornelius, or of you know, the Peter the tanner's house, and he has this vision. All right, and this sheet comes down 3 times the sheet comes down filled with all kinds of unclean animals. And he hears a voice says, Peter, rise, kill and eat. And he says, not so, Lord. I've never eaten anything unclean in my whole life. Period. The end. That's where a lot of Sunday Christians, pork eating Christians want to stop, as they see, now we can eat pork. Right there, God said it's okay. What God has declared clean, you shall not call unclean. Well, there you go. Now we can eat bacon, all the bacon we want. But it was Peter's dream. Let's let Peter tell us what it meant. Okay, I think that's only fair. I don't get to interpret Peter's dream. Okay, I didn't have the dream. Peter had the dream. God showed it to Peter. So it says he wakes up, there's a knock at the door, and he's pondering. He's like, what does that thing mean? 3 guys are at his door. A sheet comes down 3 times. 3 guys show up. They're Gentiles. They're not Jews. Okay, this is interesting. In the first century, a Jewish man, by and large, did not associate with somebody who was not Jewish because they were called impure. They were unclean. They were, people we don't want to hang out with. And so God is giving Peter this vision. And, the Spirit tells him, just go with him. All right, so he goes. They go to Cornelius' house, and he's overwhelmed by how much the Spirit has poured out. And then by verse 28, he finally says, oh, I get it. God has now shown me not to call any man common or unclean. Right? He didn't say, oh, God has now shown me not to call any animal that I can put on the menu common or unclean. He doesn't say that. He says not to call any man common or unclean. Right? So Peter finally got it, but God had to shake him. But you remember that Paul had to later call Peter out because he was being a hypocrite again. He was up in Antioch. And when he was hanging out with just the Gentile, the non-Jewish believers, it was all good. They were happy, happy, happy. But then when Jews from Jerusalem would come, Peter's like, oh, I don't know those guys. And he starts putting on this show, right? Because that was the whole point of the dream, is that Peter was a racist. I hate to say that, but that is the truth. A lot of people, and a lot of people today, but a lot of people back then, a lot of Jews back then, they were racist because they thought a non-Jew, a Gentile, was beneath them and that it was somehow ungodly to talk to them. And they didn't want to be around them because they were unclean. And so God was shaking Peter to the core to get this message through him. And he got it when he was hanging out with Cornelius. And then he was, he was hanging out with non-Jewish believers, true. But then when the other Jews showed up, then he's like, oh, I can't do that. And he was back to his hypocritical ways. Hey, I probably would have done the same thing. But Paul had to call him out and say, what are you doing, Peter? Which is it? Are you going to hang out with these guys or not? And that was the lesson. That was a very hard lesson. It took him a long time. It took him at least a decade or two to fully learn that lesson. Hey, that's fine. But that thing had nothing to do with pork on the menu. Another one, Mark chapter 7, right? The Pharisees are questioning Jesus. Why don't your disciples wash their hands according to the tradition of the elders, of the fathers? And so that's the question. It wasn't, why don't your disciples eat pork? It had nothing to do with pork, right? So Jesus then explains to them, you guys much prefer the traditions of men over against the commandments of God, and you invalidate the commandment of God so you can keep your tradition. And then he explains to his disciples that nothing that enters a man with unwashed hands, mind you, right, that goes into the mouth, then into the stomach, then your stomach does what stomachs do, and then it goes out into the sewer, and then it purges, right, that the food is eliminated from your body into the latrine. He was not talking about non-food. Imagine just for a second, the Pharisees are trying to get Jesus on any kind of technicality that they possibly can, right? I mean, they eventually come to him and they say, is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And so they're trying to trap him. What an amazing trap. If Jesus says, oh, by the way, now you're allowed to eat pork. I mean,
Yeah.
that's ludicrous. It's ludicrous to think that. And yet that is where so many of our Christian brothers think that this is where Jesus landed. Oh, and by the way, you can eat anything you want. I don't care. Look, how do we know that he wasn't saying that? Because he kept the law perfectly. Scripture is very clear about that. And guess what's in the law? Leviticus chapter 11. God tells us, plain as day, here are animals that are food, ochel, and you can, lechol, you can eat these animals because they're eating stuff. They're food. Here are animals that are not food. There you go. It's that simple. So these animals, so cows, chickens, sheep, food, okay? Deer, food. Not food. Pork, shrimp, crab, lobsters, vultures, rats, camels, right, etc. Not food, okay? It's very simple.
Mhm.
So that's all it is. And Jesus was not saying, oh, the non-food is now food. And then the last passage, this one is kind of near and dear to my heart because I actually tried to use this against a friend when I was visiting Israel in 2011. And this friend of mine, we went to school together, and I realized that he was not eating pork and I was still eating pork at that time. And I thought, oh my gosh, this guy's he's so lost. I mean, I didn't think he was lost, but I thought, he's into legalism, So I pull out 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, right? So the Spirit explicitly says, in the latter time, some will depart from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and teaching of doctrines of demons. They forbid marriage and demand abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. And I was like, there you go, right? And he calmly looked at me and said, yep. And he said, food, right? I was like, yeah, that's right, man. What are you gonna do about that? I was like picking a fight with him, right? And he says, yeah, food. And then he takes me to Leviticus 11, and he showed me what food was.
Yeah.
And boy, talk about stealing my thunder, right? It just sucked all the air out of my sails. And I was like fumbling, trying to find some kind of counter argument, but I couldn't find one, and shortly thereafter, I stopped eating pork because I'm like, I just can't get around this one. I have no idea. And, and it was weird. I went home and I was like, okay, well, and I just quietly took the pork out and threw it away. And, I try not to make a big deal of it. I wasn't trying to tell the whole world they're going to hell. I was just like, I'm just not going to eat that anymore. But it's funny because we went to my former boss's Easter celebration, right? So, and I was like, oh my goodness, he serves Easter ham, right? And I was like, what am I going to do? So I thought, well, I'll just have lots of salad and all the sides, and I'll just abstain. I'm not going to tell him he's wrong. I'm just going to abstain from eating that. But there we are in line this is a picnic outside Southern California, and so I'm getting my salad, I'm getting my corn and my potatoes, and then there he is with fork and knife ready to serve us this beautiful baked ham that he had made. And so I get there and I'm just like, oh, no thanks. He's like, oh, whoa, what's wrong with you? And I was like, I just don't really want it. Oh, did you, you think it's wrong to eat it? And I'm like, what the heck? Like, I didn't come in throwing stones at him. I wasn't trying at all. In fact, I was trying to be really coy about it. And yet somehow he sniffed me out, right? He suddenly sensed that I didn't want to eat the ham. And it's weird. It's like, why do average Christians who eat this, they just suddenly sense that you're not on board with eating pork? And even if you don't call them out, they just sense it in their spirit, and it really bothers them, because I think what they sense is like, oh, so you think you're better. And I was not at all trying to convey that at all. I just decided not to do it for me. But that's the power of when we have a standard. It's like when Daniel, he decided not to defile himself. Funny, I just heard a sermon yesterday. I went and actually I was filling in as a worship leader for a church, and the pastor was teaching on Daniel chapter 1, and he says, Daniel decided not to defile himself with their food, and probably their food was bread and water. And I went up to him after. I said, the Babylonians almost certainly had pork on their menu. He says, oh. I said, do you think maybe that's why Daniel didn't want to eat it, because they had all kinds of unclean things? He said, well, and it was, I tried not to get in his face, about it, but I was challenging him a little bit because he's a pastor. And I thought, he's just never heard this, so I'll just kind of gently brush up against him a little bit, and maybe he'll think about it for the next several weeks, and, it was foreign. He had never really considered that. And that somehow this Jewish man would not want to eat, would not to defile himself with the king's luxuries. Of course, they had pork. That was a staple in Babylon. Pork, obviously, it's a staple. And so, they're eating high on the hog, right? And Daniel's like, I'm just not going to do that. I'll just do vegetables, okay? And that way, not going to cause a scene. It wasn't bread and water. He was in the king's court. They had all the king's amazing provisions. So, of course, they were eating the best of the best. And, that pork in those days and today is considered, a really great food, etc.
Because even with Daniel, because that's actually one of the things that I've also heard that argument too. Because they're right to a degree. It doesn't say pork, it just says food. But it's interesting because Daniel then, he doesn't ask for clean meats.
Mm-hmm.
He asks for fruits and vegetables,
mm-hmm.
Which I've done kind of my own studies on, and kind of to talk about, like, I think the Hebrew word is specifically seeds, and they, looking at that. So we have two things to glean from this. Either all the meat there was unclean, so he couldn't eat any of the meats. That's why he only asked for vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
Or if all the foods there were clean meats, why did he not eat this? Because the only logical explanation is these were all contaminated, or they were all used as a sacrifice for Baal.
Yeah.
So then that itself made it unclean.
Yes. They were sacrificed to gods, which is
right.
Also very likely. Yeah, we certainly cannot. I'm not trying to say that it was only pork. I'm not saying that at all. But it almost certainly included pork.
Oh yeah. Most definitely.
Yeah.
But from the context here, it's either was pork. It was either pork or clean. But even if the clean meat was there, it was used in a profane way, which would not allow him. Because again, notice what he says: wine is used there. Right? Wine is used. Yep. Obviously, he's a young boy. It would not be healthy for him because he asked for fruits and vegetables and water. So not even if there was clean meat there, he didn't eat it. So either there was clean meat there, he didn't eat it, which we can understand why from the Torah, or to Dr. Douglas, to your point, it was obviously then pork.
Right.
You can glean that from just understanding of how he responded to the chief priest right there.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I wanted to go back to, because you brought up one of the verses I definitely wanted to talk to you about. You brought up Romans chapter 10, verse 4. And I don't want to kind of go over, because I think you did an amazing job explaining. But for anyone who wasn't exactly sure what Dr. Douglas was talking about, it's for Christ is the end of the law. And that is the big thing right there. Now, the Tree of Life version and the Complete Jewish Bible all translate that word as the goal, just as Doctor, you were bringing up. But even in verse 5, I always want to read verse 5 to people, because this is what it says. For Moses writes concerning the righteousness that comes from the law. What does he say? That the person who does these things will live by them. So isn't it weird that Christ came to end it, but then in verse 5, for Moses says that we're going to live by it. So we're going to live by something that Christ put an end to. How does that make sense?
It makes no sense. I mean, if people really thought through these arguments like you and I have had to do, and for me, I kind of did it was like pulling teeth. I was kicking and screaming. I was so worried about becoming a heretic. I'm like, oh my goodness, I'm starting to see things differently, but am I becoming a heretic by doing this? Am I going to lose my salvation? So I tell you, it's clever how Satan has kind of woven in this sense that you're betraying Christ. You're betraying your Lord and Savior if you start deciding to keep the Torah, and again, this goes for about 2,000 years because of this dude named Marcion. He's the one that essentially got this type of reinvention of the gospel, of the Torah. He was the one who had an intense hatred for the Old Testament. He gave us the term Old Testament and New Testament. He was rabidly anti-Jewish. He was anti-Sabbath, anti-Torah. All of these basic ideas that are woven into Christianity at such a fundamental level, you cannot see them until your glasses get cracked. And then you can oh, wait a second. And, so we've had to overcome these things. And again, I think most Christians are by and large keeping God's commandments because they do love the Lord. It's just that their definition, when they come to defining these things and understanding it, and certainly these three things, then they almost have a heart attack because they're like, well, we can't do that stuff. We're not supposed to do that stuff, and I won't do that stuff because then I would be somehow working for my salvation. And it's like, again, I want to make this clear for my Torah types who have come into this and they suddenly discover that we should be doing these things. I think both sides are missing the truth. I'm not keeping the food laws for God's sake. Is he pleased? Sure, of course. Just like you as a dad, when your kid does the right thing, you're happy, right?
Yeah.
But right? What my teaching my kids to look both ways. They don't come to me now and say, hey, Dad, I looked both ways when I crossed the street the other day. I'm like, okay. And I mean, you're 20. I mean, of course you look both ways, like, do you want me to give you a gold medal, a gold star or something? And way to go, son. You look both ways when you cross the street. Like, dude, of course you did. But you didn't do it for me. You did it for you. You did it for you. And when you can finally understand the motivation of the Father to the Son, to us as children, as his children, he's giving us his instructions as a loving father because he doesn't want us to get hit by that bus. And that's essentially what we're doing when we do things God said to do or not do things God said not to do. We're avoiding the bus. We're not going to get hit by the bus. And does that make the father happy? Yeah. Hey, my son didn't get hit by a bus today. Great. I'm really happy about that. Right. But I'm not like rejoicing that he looked both ways when he crossed the street. I'm like, well, of course you did, dude. Like, why wouldn't you? I'd be shocked if you didn't look both ways. And every so often there's a person who gets distracted. They're on their phone or whatever, and they don't look both ways. And boom, they get hit by a bus, right? And of course, we're all sad about that. But guess what? The guy's dead. Do we say, oh, he's a terrible sinner because he didn't look both ways when he crossed the street? Like, well, he screwed up. He sinned. A sin, the basic definition of a sin is to just miss the mark. That's all it means, right? That's all the word chet or sin in English. It just means that you're shooting for the bullseye and you missed. Okay. And if you miss the bullseye, that's a sin. And so if you forget to look both ways because you got distracted by your phone or whatever, and you get hit by the bus, it doesn't mean that you're morally, depraved. It just means that you didn't look and now you're dead.
Right.
And I'm really sorry about that. And it makes us all sad because now you're 6 feet under. Right. So, and so that's the case in everything that we do. If we ingest, whether it's clean or not clean animals, if we ingest any kind of poison, whether it's biblically okay, but it's still not good for us. Well, God isn't delighted in that because he's like, well, I don't know, man, it might make you fat, it might make you stupid, it might make you just lethargic. So I'm not delighting in that because it's not making you healthy. And when you don't take a day off, I'm not like angry at you. I'm just bummed because I know that I made the body. I know the body in its current condition, its fallen state, it needs a day off. And guess the other thing, when you don't spend time, you take a day off. Well, when are we going to hang out together? Because I've put this on my calendar every seventh day, hang out with Doug. Okay. And if I don't show up on that day, well, then that day is lost. Doesn't mean God's going to throw me into hell. It just means that there was a day to spend with God that I decided I don't really want to take this day and hang out with him. And God's like, well, there I was waiting for you at the coffee shop and you didn't show up. And well, we missed that one. You ever miss an appointment? And like I've had an appointment and I missed it. And and sometimes it's with a really important person, whether it's romantically or if it's professionally, and you miss that, you feel like a heel. You're like, I am so sorry. And they're like, well, okay, I forgive you. It's all good. But I still missed it. I can't make up that appointment. I can't do it again because that time is lost. That time is over. And when we don't hang out with God in the time that he's designated to hang out, well, we're missing a really important appointment. And, and the feasts are the same way. You got these 7 feasts. We always want to party. We want some time off. God's like, well, I've put 7 holidays on the calendar, and six of them include food. Okay, one of them is a little fast, giving your body a break from food altogether. Another week, you're just taking some time off from yeast, but otherwise, there's plenty of food, man. And we're like, oh, I'm not going to do that because it's like, well, I don't know. I see God he's like a sine wave, okay? And I want to, instead of being like this, where I am canceling out with God, I want to be on the same sine wave as God. I want to be in parallel and sync with God. And when we start to keep his feast, we're on that same rhythm. In fact, I've written a book called Ancient Rhythms for Modern Hearts, and people can check that out. It's on Amazon if you want to take a deeper look. But the whole idea is to get in sync with God. I want to be on his calendar. I want to be in sync with his rhythm. And look, he's not going to change his rhythm for me. He's God, he's not going to change for me. And thank God that God is God and that he doesn't go just changing for me, right? And the words of Billy Joel, don't go changing, right? To try to please me. He's not, God, he cannot change because he's perfect. How do you change perfection? You can't.
Right.
You cannot change perfection. That's what makes it perfect. And so if I'm not in sync with God, it's not his fault. It's my fault. It means that I'm on a different rhythm. And so if God is doing this and then I'm doing this, well, guess what? We're going to cancel. That's called deconstructive interference. And that's when you have a net zero, right? You cancel out whatever you were doing. And when you feel like, why is this so hard? Well, probably because you're swimming upstream. I've gotten to the place in life like, dude, I just want to float downstream. Okay. And if God is the stream, I just want to get in his stream and just float along. But so much of the time we spend life trying to swim upstream. Like, it's just so hard. And I'm always working so hard. And like, yeah, because you're swimming upstream, bro. And if you will just turn around and just go with the flow, with God's flow, well, then he'll carry you along. You'll discover there's no more resistance. There's no more. I'm not saying that life is suddenly always easy, but at least I'm flowing in the right direction with God instead of working against God.
Right. Now, I got 2 scriptures I want to read to you, and I want to get your opinion on this. So the first one, and both of these scriptures are probably one of my favorites. I don't know if I necessarily have a favorite Bible verse. I feel like there's so many verses, that can help you in different situations. The first one is Ecclesiastes 12:13. I think you probably read it once or twice. I'm pretty sure. But it says, at the end of the matter, all has been heard, to fear God and keep his commandments, for that is the whole duty of everyone. This is the the NRSVUE Bible. Yeah. And the second verse I want to read is 1 John 5:3. For the love of God is this, that we obey his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever is born of God conquers the world, and this is the victory that conquers the world, our faith. That's also verse 4.
Yep. Yep.
Now, my question to you is this. What are Christians who don't practice the law? And yes, there are brothers and sisters. They know who Jesus is, they accept him, but what are they missing by not following these two verses? What do you think is really missing from their life, and how could these verses really benefit their relationship with their wife or their husband, their kids, their workers, their fellow neighbors, and God?
You know, when I started really taking God's law more seriously, I discovered freedom. That's what it sounds, very counterintuitive for many Christians. What do you mean keeping the law? Now it's freedom. Well, again, I was already doing like 98% of the law. I just discovered 3 things that I was essentially missing. And when you realize that you can take off your Saturday, you can take it off, and there's no pressure to work. In fact, there's an expectation to just chill, relax, fellowship, and there's zero guilt. Wow. Because, sometimes when you take a day off, maybe you take off a Monday or a Tuesday, and, I always kind of feel like, well, yeah, I'm out doing something fun, but I really should be working. I can sort of feel that guilt a little bit, maybe rightfully so during the week, but on Saturday, oh no, I don't have any more sense of, well, I really should be working. I should be productive right now. And in America, we're very much about productivity, and we always we have to be doing something. We got to be working. We've got to earn our day off. There's very much built into the American psychology that I can take a day off when I've earned it. And God says, no, you don't have to earn this one. This is a gift. This is a gift. You get this day off, whether you earned it or not.
Mm-hmm.
Saturday, Shabbat, is your day off. And that is a God-given right. Oh my goodness. It frees you up mentally, spiritually, emotionally. Now you have time to hang out with your kids. Because, not because, well, I finally earned it. If you don't take time off, you'll just never will. If you don't allocate the time off, then you'll just never do it. You'll never find that it's there. I read this book to my kids when they were little. It's called the Hotel Infinity, and it was all about infinite numbers and mathematical stuff, and it was really fun. And I think I learned as much as they did. All right. And the weird, and so this cat lives at this Hotel Infinity, and the cat was always amazed how the owners, the owners of the hotel, they always found more space for new numbers that arrived, even though every room in the hotel was booked. If a new number showed up, they're like, well, how can we make room when every room is already full? And, just kind of by everybody moving over one, then suddenly there was a space, and the cat's like, oh my gosh, how did this happen? But I bring that up because your life is infinitely full. And yet somehow when you make space, when you carve out a time, it shows up, right? It's like magic. Like, well, how did that happen? How did we get this? How did we get this time? Because you made time for it. That's how. Because you put it on the calendar. And suddenly by putting on the calendar, it becomes real. It becomes holy, right? Holy is not just this really religious kind of thing. Holy just means set apart. And so if you set apart time for your kid's birthday, well, then there you go. You set apart time for your kid's birthday. And guess what? If you don't, then you won't have it, right? It'll be time that's lost. It'll just meld into everything else, like your kid's coloring thing, when everything was all just one color, right? It all just melded together. And so by having articulation of it, by having a framework around it, a parameter, then suddenly there is this new time that's just there it is, right? And so that's one of the benefits of keeping the Sabbath and kind of doing it religiously, so to speak, is that you kind of have to do some things religiously in life or you won't do them at all. And so I found freedom. I found incredible freedom in that. And when you go to your average church, there's all these unwritten rules, lots and lots of unwritten rules. Oh, can't drink. That's clearly ungodly thing to do, even though the Bible says you can. Just be wise about it.
Right.
And you got to wear your Sunday best. Well, the Bible doesn't actually say that, right? There's all these unwritten rules of what you can and cannot do. And when you start seeing God's commandments in a whole different light, you begin to realize, wow, these things are not from the checklist. It's not a checklist Christianity. It's now the spirit Christianity. I'm now doing things in the spirit of my Father, in the spirit of Yeshua, Messiah. And when I realize that this thing is either healthy for me or it's not healthy for me, or maybe it's not healthy for somebody else, I start acting in a different way because I'm not just trying to please the Father. I lived that way for a long time. I was just trying to please God. And, it led to some good behavior in a sense, but it was always this kind of behavior where I was trying to earn it. I was trying to be good for daddy's sake, instead of just loving my daddy, and so I found freedom in that. I'm not trying to please God in the same sense that I used to. Yes, of course I want to please God, but I'm not trying to please him just to please him. I'm trying to live a good life. I'm trying to live a right or righteous life. And when I do that, I know that my Father is pleased. And so I'm not doing it for him anymore. And that's probably the most liberating thing that I've ever experienced.
Oh, that's beautiful. Well, real quick, before we close out, I just want to tell everyone that Dr. Douglas Hamp's information, his YouTube and his TikTok is in the description below. Please check it out. And then if you can, please show the book one more time.
Yeah. Ancient
and
Rhythm.
Then the Ancient Rhythms. Was it for Modern Hearts? If you guys can, definitely check. That's on Amazon, correct?
Yes. Yep. It's on Amazon.
And then if anyone's in the Denver, or if you live in Colorado, make the trip. Go check out, what's the name of your congregation?
The Way Congregation. Yeah. The Way Congregation. Yeah. So there, hopefully I think I misspelled it, but anyway, thewaycongregation.com. So people are most welcome to join us.
Yeah, go check them out if you guys are definitely in the area or if you're even visiting. So again, Dr. Douglas Hamp, thank you so much for jumping on, talking about pronomianism. I love promoting this and just to have someone of your expertise to come on and just to tell us more about it. It means a lot.
Thank you.
So perfect. I will see you guys on the next one. Shalom, everyone.